First Kings opens with David being old and feeble, and a son named Adonijah taking advantage of this by claiming succession to the throne. But as we can see down here in verse 11, and I may just scroll the right side today, the prophet Nathan tells Bathsheba what's going on, and down in verse 28, they managed to get David to formally name her son Solomon as David's successor with the help of the priest Zadok and some others. And then down in verse 40, when Adonijah and Joab realize what just happened, they run for cover. So, because they had made him king instead. But down in verse 50, we see that Solomon declares that he'll only execute Adonijah if he turns out to be disloyal. So he's still holding back a little bit and waiting to see what the guy does. So now in chapter 2, David gives Solomon final advice and instructions, which include avenging those who he himself was not permitted to harm. Just because David wouldn't strike down someone sent by God to torment him for his sin didn't mean Solomon couldn't. So after David's death, we'll see down here in verse 12, Solomon gets busy tying up the loose ends, and some try to use Bathsheba unwittingly to allow the throne to be usurped by marriage. So she doesn't, know all the stuff that's going on, and so that somebody comes and asks for the hand in marriage of one of the ladies there, and she says, "You have my permission, but we have to ask him," so. I think, yes, it was one of David's concubines, I believe, that this guy wanted to marry. But, of course, down in verse 22, Solomon's already fairly wise on his own, and he sees right through this. And then you can see down verse 29, went a little too far there, that Joab has run to take hold of the altar of God as a sanctuary from Solomon, but it does him no good, and he's executed for his treachery against David. If you remember, he killed some people he wasn't supposed to kill that David said not to, so he is paid back for that. And then we go down to verse 36, and the same thing happens to that pest Shimei, or whatever his name was, and then Solomon has secure control over the whole kingdom of Israel. So now we go down to chapter 3, and he gets busy, Solomon does, marrying wives, starting with the daughter of Pharaoh, but he only partially reestablishes proper worship of God. So this is going to turn out to be a very bad idea for this wise man, although he has not yet come to acquire the wisdom, and that happens starting in verse 5. This is the story of how Solomon was granted this extraordinary wisdom from God. And so God appears to him in a dream and asks what gift he would like as the new king. And because Solomon asked for the wisdom to guide the nation, God grants him not only the most wisdom anyone could ever have, he also grants what he didn't ask for, riches, honor, and long life. But again, it's conditional. He must walk in the ways of his father David. People don't pay attention to these conditions. And they say, hey, this forever means forever. Well, there was a condition attached. So let's go down to verse 16. Then comes the first demonstration of Solomon's wisdom. Two prostitutes are fighting over a baby. They lived in the same house, and one rolled over on her baby during the night and suffocated it, so she switched babies before the other woman woke up. And so they go to Solomon to determine which woman is the real mother, and his test is hailed as ingenious. The real mother valued the baby's life over having custody, while the fake one would rather have the baby die than give it back to her real mother. So that was the incident that sparked everybody's acknowledgement of his divine wisdom. And then down in chapter 4, the narrative moves to identifying the members of Solomon's royal court. And just as a bit of trivia, it's in verse 8 that we see the name Ben-Hur from the famous book and movie. And then we'll go down to chapter 4, I think. No, we're in chapter 4, verse 20. Can't read my own notes. And the narrative continues to how Solomon became wealthy and famous around the world for his wisdom, just as God promised. And in verse 33, it says that he produced manuals on botany describing all sorts of plants, and on biology, describing all sorts of animals and fish. So he was something of a scientist in the day, as well as being wise in general in judicial matters that we just saw. So let's skip down. He's gathering material for the temple. We'll go down to chapter 6. We see that the construction of the temple began 408 years after Egypt, or after Israel left Egypt. So if you wanted to continue on with the chart, the timeline, there's some data for you to use. And then this is also 4 years after Solomon became king. So that's when he started the temple construction. And from the details given, many have tried to visualize the structure and the layout of the temple area. And there's one example of this you can see at the link in the description. Now, according to verse 30, it says that it takes 7 years to complete the temple. And then in chapter 7, it takes 13 more years to complete the palace. So in addition to being politically wise, Solomon was also, as I mentioned, well-versed in the sciences and also construction, structural engineering, and that sort of thing. So then we go down to chapter 8. Finally, the Ark of the Covenant is moved from Zion to the temple, but for some reason, by this time, the Ark only contains the stone tablets. Now, in other passages before this, when the Ark is described, we see things placed before or beside the Ark, but the statement here seems to indicate that those things had been put inside at some point, because why else point out that it only contained the stone tablets if that's all that were ever in it? So that's why I question that. But then we'll go down to verse 10 and see that when everything is in place, this cloud of God's glory fills the temple. They call that the Shekinah glory. And Solomon proceeds with its dedication. And in his long speech, you'll see repeated appeals for God to have mercy on his wayward people who are sure to go astray and bring disaster upon themselves. It's just pretty much a given. And Solomon will do the same thing. Even though he sees this coming, he will also fall. But then we'll go down to, you can read through that, we'll go down to chapter 9, this is very long, in chapter 8. And God appears to Solomon again after all this and reminds him that his continued blessings depend on continued obedience. There's a condition again. And then chapter 10, we meet the famous Queen of Sheba, or Seba, from which we get a more familiar name, the Sabians, believed to have been in southern Arabia. She was not African. And in Matthew 12:42, she is called the Queen of the South. She comes to test Solomon's reputation of being wise with a bunch of tricky questions. And once more, I would ask why anyone could use biblical facts to argue that women are not credible witnesses. But even Solomon would later seem to forget this in some of his proverbs. You can see some things he says about women that are not exactly complimentary, in spite of the fact that the Queen of Sheba proved that this is not something that is a women problem, it's a society problem. So she's very impressed, not only with his wisdom, but also his palace and food service and all that goes with that. So she returns to her homeland, and that's all Scripture says about her. Some urban legends believe she had a child with Solomon, but there's no evidence of this. She is mentioned a few times, I think, by Jesus in the New Testament, that she will rise up and condemn that generation, but there's nothing about her having a child with Solomon. So then we'll go down to verse 21. And, excuse me, and we see there that there's just more about Solomon's wealth, such that silver was as common as stones and cedar was as common as the local fig trees. Then we'll go down to chapter 11. The thing is, when living is easy, people drop their guard and get lazy, and Solomon was no exception. So all this wealth and all the wives in the world couldn't satisfy him, and he took wives from many nations, though God had forbidden anyone in Israel from doing so. He wound up with 700 wives and 300 concubines from heathen lands, and this is just asking for trouble. So in his old age, having abandoned his wisdom, Solomon turns to the heathen gods, at least partially, and we've already learned how deadly compromise can be. And you would think Solomon would know this. And then down in verse 7, he sets up shrines for the detestable gods Chemosh and Milcom, among any others that his wives worshipped. So God tells him that the kingdom will be torn from his family after his death. But to keep his promise to David, God will leave one tribe in his line and reserve the city of Jerusalem. So again, God has chosen Jerusalem. He's not giving it up. at least not for as long as there was an Israel and a Judah, which is about to split apart here. Verse 26 is where we can see that this tearing begins with the rebellion, it says, of Jeroboam. We might short to Jero sometimes, just gets awkward saying it so many times, but Jeroboam, one of Solomon's servants, is who's going to get the kingdom from him. But in verse 31, we can see there that God says through the prophet Ahijah or something like that, that God will only give him 10 tribes and leave one for Solomon. So where's the 12th tribe? We know from other passages that the southern kingdom would consist of Judah and Benjamin, but the exact number of tribes at this time seems to be somewhat fluid. And there is a link to a brief article about that in the description. So then we'll go down here to verse 35. And we see that God has selected Jero to rule over the northern kingdom of Israel, but Solomon tries to kill him, so he takes refuge in Egypt until Solomon's death. And notice in verse 36 that God claims Jerusalem as his home, again, which is a critical piece of information in Bible prophecy. So this is a big deal. When you study prophecy, a lot hinges on Jerusalem specifically. So then in verse 39, God says that he is humiliating David's descendants, but not forever, because of his promise, though some people erroneously believe that God abandoned his promises to David after the 1st century AD. Somehow they believe that. And then finally Solomon dies and is succeeded by his son Rehoboam, who I might call Rio. Then we'll go down to chapter 12, and Jero hears the news and he goes to Rio to petition for a lighter burden than Solomon had put on the nation. So he's not ready to do the complete split yet. So Rio sends them off for 3 days while he consults with his advisors, and the older ones wisely advise him to grant the request and gain the loyalty of Jero and his people. But the younger ones advise him to be even harsher, and that's the advice he takes. So down in verse 15, this is God working behind the scenes to complete the dividing of the nation. So it's going to happen. He said it was going to happen. And even though Jero offers reconciliation, God makes sure that Rio doesn't agree with it. And so the split happens. And we see in verse 23 that God tells Jero that Israel must not attack Judah because he was planning to do so. And oddly enough, he listens. Go figure. But then down in verse 25, to keep anyone from thinking about defecting to his rival king, he has some golden calves made and puts one in Bethel and the other in Dan for the people to worship. Because it's just too far, too much trouble, let's go to these other places and worship these idols. You would think he'd have some memory of how this sort of thing has worked out for example, Aaron back in the day. But no, and he makes up festivals for the same days as the old ones and a priesthood from non-Levites. Apostasy complete. Where have we also seen this idea of covering up one set of holidays with another? Well, that would be in about the 3rd century AD with Constantine and that era, taking the same pagan temples, the same pagan idols, and the same pagan holidays and slapping a Christian veneer on them. So it's a problem. But let's go down, let's keep to the text here and go down to chapter 13. As Jero is about to make certain sacrifices, God sends a prophet to pronounce curses on the altar where he was going to make them. So God will raise up a descendant of David named Josiah, who will take the fake priests and sacrifice them on that very altar. Not as a sacrifice to God, as just putting people to death, so don't go crazy on that. And to prove this was from God, the altar would split open and spill its ashes on the ground. But the now enraged Jero stretches out his hand and yells, "Seize him," but the hand shrivels up and he can't pull it back. And just then the altar splits apart as prophesied. So you would think people would take a hint, but they don't. Then down in verse 6, Jero wants mercy, and the prophet prays for his hand to be healed, and God grants it. But then this really bizarre event happens as the prophet returns home. God, and he isn't named as far as I can tell, at least not in this passage. But God had told this prophet to not eat or drink in that place, but after he refuses Jero's offer of food, he is met along the way home by an older prophet who makes the same offer using the lie that God told him to go ahead and eat. So God is testing him. But the younger prophet goes ahead and eats because he says, well, this is a prophet of God. God must have changed his command. And during the meal, God causes the older prophet to rebuke him for his rebellion. So again, our lesson in this test is to stay true to what we know God has said, even if someone with impressive credentials comes along to give a new revelation. There are so many who have tried over the years, over the centuries, even today. This is very common. We have a new revelation that we don't do this or that anymore. The Bible is outdated. That's where Islam came from. That's where Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, everybody wants to update the Bible. But this is rebellion against God. So now let's go down to verse 22. And the younger prophet leaves, and along the way he's attacked and killed by a lion, but the lion doesn't eat him or the donkey he was riding. He just stands there. And again, I would ask the critics whether a story like this would be something a Jewish writer would make up. Now, it's true that some people can imagine some pretty wild things, but all of this fits together when you consider the Bible as a whole, whether it's prophetic or symbolic of some principle of God. So it fits. This one fits. So this is not, again, this is an evidence that it's not fiction, as far as I'm concerned. And then down in verse 33, even after all this, Jero sticks to his evil ways. So his son Abijah, or Abijah, whatever, becomes ill, which prompts Jero to seek out the prophet that had told him he'd be king of Israel. Because he's like, what's happening to my heir? So he sends his wife, but he has her wear a disguise to go see the prophet. But who would think a prophet wouldn't know who she was? It's just like with Saul and the witch of Endor. Why put on a disguise to someone you believe has actual psychic powers? It doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, let's go down to 14 verse 7. And the prophet gives her the message that disaster will fall on Jero and his whole family, so none of them will ever sit on the throne of Israel. And it will begin as soon as she sets foot in her home, because her son will die at that moment. And before we continue, notice verse 19's reference. Let me move that up a little bit. And it says, the annals of the kings of Israel. Some argue that if the Bible makes reference to a body of literature, then that literature should be preserved as scripture. This is especially the case with the book of Enoch, which incidentally is not mentioned in scripture as a book, but merely a quote. So why doesn't anyone claim that these annals of the kings of Israel should be in scripture? And that someone took them out as part of an evil plan to hide truth from us? The simple answer is that many want Enoch to be scripture, but they really don't care about royal exploits in history, so that's why the double standard. That's why also the fallacy called special pleading, or a number of others you could classify it as, but it is inconsistent. And they want Enoch because they want it, and they make up excuses. Well, it's referenced in the New Testament, and again, no book is referenced, and that doesn't mean the book, even if it were one, should be in Scripture and was taken out by evil people. The people who say something was taken out of Scripture need to prove that it was there in the first place. So the point being, once again, that the mere mention in Scripture of something doesn't qualify what's being referenced as on the same level as Scripture. So this argument should not be used to say a certain thing was taken out of the Bible. So now let's go down to chapter 14, verse 19. Whoops, I think we were already there. And this is also the account of Jero, whose son Nadab replaces him. And then the text switches over to what's going on with Rio. Not surprisingly, Judah has also turned to evil, so God allows Egypt to attack them and loot the temple and royal palace. In the meantime, then eventually Rio also dies and is replaced by his son Abijah. So from this point on, we'll go down to chapter 15, we see that there's this downward spiral of degeneracy just continuing, and God allows the dynasty to continue only for David's sake. So that's why sometimes it doesn't make sense why God did this but not that. It's because there's a reason, and sometimes the reason is his purpose, his promise that he made, and he has to keep it somehow. And yet also deal with sin. So that's what's going on there. And then we come down to verse 9. of chapter 15. And along came a king of Judah named Asa, who actually did good things. He was a good king, and he included undoing all the bad things his predecessors had done. So he wiped out the shrines and so forth. But there was always bickering and war between the two kings of Judah and Israel as long as they lived. And after Asa came his son Jehoshaphat to rule Judah. And then the text turns back to pick up the reign of Nadab over Israel. So we'll get a little section of something on one king, then a section on the other. And so it can be confusing, but if you keep in mind whether they're talking about Israel or Judah, it helps to straighten that out. But unlike Asa, Nadab is evil, and he is eventually assassinated and replaced by someone called Baasha, who goes on to execute all of Jero's family as prophesied. So God will use evil people to carry out his will. And it isn't as though he's operating like puppets either. He can arrange circumstances such as preserving David's line. It's like, as I've described before, this issue of free will and God's sovereignty is like a playground with a fence around it. The children are told that they can play whatever they want. That's not structured play. They can run around play on whatever swings or slide or whatever. But there are a few little rules, like don't punch people, don't cut in line, and so forth. And the fence is there not to keep the children from being free or to tell them what games to play, but to keep them safe from things like cars on the road outside the playground. So that's bounded free will, and it means that we do have a moral choice. We always have a moral choice, but sometimes God will limit our freedom in other areas so that certain things come to pass. So the argument, especially by Calvinism or any kind of predestination theory that holds that we're not saved by our own efforts, because they hold that faith is an effort and it's not Bible. The scripture explicitly states that faith and works are not the same. Faith is not a work. And so this idea of how God is maneuvering things behind the scenes does not violate free moral choice. It never does. So back to the back and forth between the two kings. It gets difficult to follow, but there's a chart linked in the description, as always, the same source of charts that might help a little bit. It's a quick drawing, cartoon-like overview of the whole book. So you might reference that or some other things you can find. And so now we're going to skip over some of these other kings and go down to the famous Ahab in verse 29. And Ahab is made king of Judah, and he's very evil. And he marries this princess because she's the daughter of another king, and her name is Jezebel. Yes, that Jezebel. And they're both worshippers of Baal. And then we go down, we see in verse 34 there, it briefly mentions the fulfillment of Joshua's curse on whoever rebuilt Jericho. And then the text picks up again the thread of the prophet Elijah as he encounters Ahab and Jezebel. So we've got three big names here: Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel, and this is going to go on for a while. And then we'll skip down here to chapter 17, where God sends Elijah to tell Ahab there will be no rain or dew unless Elijah allows it. So he's controlling the weather and whether they have a famine. So and then after giving that message, he hides out at a place near a stream where God supplies him with bread and meat delivered by ravens. This is another one of those crazy stories that can't be true, but why not? I mean, this is stated matter of fact in a text that is matter of fact historical record. So, but anyway, the stream dries up eventually because Elijah is withholding the rain, so God tells him to go stay with this certain widow. And again, God isn't doing things behind the scene, and this event that we're about to read about will be referenced in the New Testament as another lesson. So that's why God lets these things happen. So we go down to verse 9. And it turns out that this widow and her son expect to die of starvation after she makes one last meal with the little bit of flour and oil she has. But Elijah assures her that if she takes him in, they will all have food to live on, and that's how it turns out. So this is a miracle that many people have referenced outside of Scripture as well. And then down verse 17, then eventually the son becomes seriously ill, and the mother asks if Elijah only came to remind her of her sin, whatever that was. We aren't told. So he takes the boy to a room and begs God to heal him, and God does. So she is assured that Elijah is indeed a prophet of God. So there's other things going on that may be just for her benefit, that God took notice of this poor widow and made a lesson out of it. So there are things God doesn't have to explain, or it was, if not preserved as recorded in Scripture. Now down to chapter 18. After the famine has been going on for 3 years, God tells Elijah to present himself to Ahab. Of course, he doesn't want to because Ahab's going to kill him, but God says, go. And the text mentions someone named Obadiah as a loyal follower of God who had hidden all the prophets when Jezebel was bent on killing them. So we only have reference to that backstory here, and we don't know if this Obadiah is the same as an Old Testament book by that name that we'll encounter later. Anyway, because of the famine, Ahab had sent out Obadiah to help him find pasture land. So even the king and this other guy are out looking for places to grow food. So it's that bad. And then down in verse 7, it says that along the way, Obadiah meets up with Elijah. And Elijah tells Obadiah to inform Ahab that he's back, and he arranges to meet him. So this is where we see the epic showdown between the prophets of Baal and the prophets of God. So they all gather at this place called Mount Carmel, where Elijah challenges the people gathered to watch the show and decide which god they will follow. So down here in verse 21, we can see that he goes on to tell them he's outnumbered by Baal's prophets 450 to 1. But each side has the same challenge. Get their god to light a fire on a prepared sacrificial animal. So there's an altar, an animal, there's wood on the fire, and God is supposed to light it. So Baal's prophets go first, and the people agree that whoever's god lights the fire wins their loyalty. So these Baal's prophets start their rituals and continue all morning without results, and so Elijah starts to taunt them. Yell louder, maybe Baal is meditating, or he took a break, or went on a trip, or fell asleep. He's just mercilessly taunting them over the inaction of their God. So then down in verse 21, which I think I already scrolled to by accident, Baal's prophets by this time decide to up their game, and they worship more frantically all afternoon, and they cut themselves and their blood flows, and they're working themselves into this big frenzy. And nothing happens, of course, and now it's Elijah's turn. So go down here to verse 30. And he says, everybody step up and watch this. So he builds an altar. They're watching him build this altar out of 12 stones to match the tribes of Israel, which again is 12. It's this fluid number that seems to be going on about that time. He digs a deep trench around the pile of rocks. And then he has servants pour so much water over the whole altar and sacrificial animal and wood and everything that it fills the trench. So the likelihood of the wood spontaneously bursting into flame is pretty much zero at this point. Everything is soaked. And then he waits till evening, and he prays to God to answer him. And as soon as he's finished praying, God shoots down this fire from heaven, whether it's lightning, who knows, but it doesn't say lightning, it's fire from heaven that consumes not only the animal, but the wood, the stones, the dirt, and all the water in the trench. So basically take that, Baal. So down in verse 38, finally the people start chanting that God is their God, and Elijah orders them to quickly seize Baal's prophets to be executed, and they gather them all together, and Elijah himself puts them to death. And once that's done, he tells Ahab to prepare for a rainstorm. So the end of the showdown is the end of the drought. So now in chapter 19, Ahab goes home and starts moping about all this. So Jezebel sends a message to Elijah that she intends to kill him. So as if he's already forgotten what God just did, he runs and hides in the desert and asks God to take his life. Sounds a little bit like Jonah that we'll read about later on. So then he just lays down and falls asleep. He's totally depressed in spite of everything. But God's messenger comes to revive him, whether this was an angel or a pre-incarnate Christ or whatever. And then Elijah has the strength and stamina to travel for 40 days and nights to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, if you'll recall. And then we'll go down to verse 9. And it says that he hides in a cave and God speaks to him and passes by the entrance of the cave. It's also a familiar passage due to the manner in which God does this. Not with the strong wind, not with the earthquake, not with the fire. but with the quiet whisper. And we refer to this many times as Christians, waiting for that still small voice instead of expecting God to shout. And so being a good listener is really vital, but few people actually do that, even Christians. They just don't listen very well. They want to tell, they don't want to hear. And then they wonder why God doesn't talk to them, because he's not going to shout over them. So now in verse 12, and what God tells him to do is to go to Damascus and anoint Jehu king over Israel to replace Ahab, even though Ahab hasn't died yet, and Elisha as his own replacement. So he's taking on an apprentice, basically. And as for Elijah's claim that he was the only prophet left, God informs him that he still had 7,000 loyal followers. So, and we often feel isolated and the only person standing, but just because we can't see people or hear people doesn't mean they're not there, although it would be nice sometimes to know that. And God tells him here, and so the first thing that happens of the two things God said is Elijah finds Elisha, who attends to him from that point on as his apprentice. And then chapter 20 is where God is arranging the downfall of Ahab. So he has the king of Syria march against Samaria, where Ahab was. And then we'll go down to verse 13. And we see there that God delivers Israel from the first attack. So they try again, but God plans to deliver them again simply to prove that it's by his power and not that of the small army of Israel. And then down in verse 35, we see that Ahab lets the enemy king live. And God tells him it will cost him his own life. So now we'll go down to chapter 21. And we come to the incident Ahab and Jezebel are most known for, the one that those with pride in male flesh love to cite. It happens that someone named Naboth owns a vineyard next to Ahab's palace, and Ahab wants it. But Naboth won't sell it to him. That's pretty much what the thumbnail image of the video is about. I think it captured it perfectly. So Ahab sits in his palace and pouts, and like a child throwing a tantrum, he crawls into bed and won't eat his supper. He's a big baby. So Jezebel, the adult in the relationship, though an evil one, is incensed that the high and mighty king doesn't take what he wants, just up and take it. So we can see in verse 7 that she essentially pats him on the head and tells him it'll be all right, and goes off to take Naboth's field herself. So she gets some scoundrels to falsely accuse Naboth of cursing God and Ahab, so they haul him off and execute him by stoning, and the field is now Ahab's to take. So we'll go down to verse 17. God tells Elijah to go confront Ahab as he arrives at the stolen vineyard. And he informs him that in the very spot where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, they will do the same to Ahab. So in addition, Jezebel will be eaten by dogs outside the wall of Jezreel, but we won't see that just yet. Now, the reason I said earlier that those with pride in male flesh love to cite this passage is that they claim Jezebel's greatest sin was not necessarily idolatry or even murder, but taking the lead from her husband. From this false narrative, they invent something called a Jezebel spirit, which they use to beat non-compliant women into submission. Scripture says no such thing, neither expressed nor implied. We have already seen women like Abigail and Sarah take the lead, and they're commended by Scripture. Modern Christianity is more restrictive and demeaning of women than anything God ever tolerated, and that includes both Testaments. The New Testament does not treat women like this spirit of Jezebel crowd. So let's go down to chapter 22, and sometime later the kings of Judah and Israel decide to jointly attack land from the king of Syria, but they inquire of God first. However, the prophet they need to ask is called Micaiah or something like that, and Ahab hates him because he never tells him what he wants to hear. Ahab, this big pouting baby. Then we go down to verse 8, and these two kings of Judah and Israel sit on their thrones while they wait for this prophet, and they have all their prophets telling them what they want to hear, but when Micaiah arrives, he sarcastically tells them the same as all the other prophets. And so Ahab snaps at him to cut that out and tell the truth. So Micaiah does, we can see down in verse 17. And he's rewarded for his honesty by being punched in the jaw by some guy named Zedekiah, and then he's sent to jail. Talk about shooting the messenger. So down in verse 27, we see that this battle begins, And when an archer shoots at random during the battle, he just happens, to hit Ahab between the plates of his armor. So Ahab is taken out of the battle by his charioteer, and he sits there and props up on his spear and watches the battle, but eventually bleeds out and dies. And so it was that dogs did indeed lick up his blood, as prophesied. And we won't read about Jezebel's death really until 2 Kings 9, so we'll have to wait a while for that. And then down here in verse 41, the last section, the text reports that Jehoshaphat becomes king of Judah, and he's a good king like Asa for the most part. Then he dies and is succeeded by his son Jehoram, and meanwhile Ahab's son Ahaziah becomes king of Israel, but he's evil like his parents. And that's how 1 Kings ends. So we'll start the next part in the next lesson. So in a lot of these, first and second are really continuations, at least in the Old Testament, not so much in the New. But we'll pick up 2 Kings next time.